Today we're making tiny little fruiting trees. Adding a little bit of color to your fantasy world is a lot of fun, and then your players might be able to find some food on their journey. I've gone through so many apples trying to get this shot right. Let's get into the build. This video, while it's focused on fruiting trees, is also going to give you the ability to make a whole heap of different types and simple, smaller trees for any terrain build. And we all know that's probably the most commonly used piece of terrain on any game board. Our first trees are going to be made using, well, sticks that I pulled out of the garden.
I literally found this piece on the sidewalk on my way home from the gym today, so we'll be using that for one. I'm going to glue it down to an old 3D printed base, but you could really glue this down to anything flat with just a little bit of super glue and an accelerant to speed up the process. Could also use a little bit of bicarb soda here, works just as well. Now, because this stick is a little bit fragile and soft, I'm going to coat the entire thing with some cheap watery super glue just to give it a nice hard external layer. You probably don't need that, but it will help with the longevity. Now, just covering up that base with a little bit of texture paint. Alternatively, you could just paint it brown or glue down a little bit of dirt or sand. And for the main foliage, I'm going to be grabbing out this clump foliage. I'm basically just grabbing my piece once everything has dried, adding a little bit of gel super glue onto the tops and anywhere I want there to be, that green foliage, and dunking it into my bag. It all clumps up and grabs pretty well, but there will be a few spots that are missed, so you just fill those in based on what you want. But as I've said on a lot of my builds before, nature tends to do whatever it wants, so it doesn't matter if there's a few bits missing here and there. And just like that, we have our first tree base. Now I want to try something a little bit different, so I'm going to grab out this mold I made for a window, fill it in with a little bit of glue and cardboard, and just add a very straight basic stick. Once again, just super gluing that in place, hitting it with the accelerant to speed up the process, then filling in that base with a little bit of wood glue and some sand to give us that earthy base. And this time I'm going to use hot glue to hold all of our clump foliage in place. Hot glue is a great option here, but you've just got to let it cool a little bit so you don't burn your fingers. Now that's looking pretty good, but I want to fill in the base with something a little bit more like this is a planted garden. So I'll glue down some of this tiny little bark that I got from the hobby shop. And now we have a nice purposely planted tree.
The stick trees came out looking really nice, but now it's time to try something a little bit more controllable. This one's using the pipe cleaner method from Encounter Terrain to build out the base of our trees, and then I'm going to try a couple of different toppings. So we're going to have the basic clump foliage, as well as some of this artificial moss from Amazon.
So you may have seen me use this before, or you may be following Encounter Terrain already, but essentially what we do here is we grab out some pipe cleaners. We cut them down to size in this case because we want them to be very short. I'm not going for anything massive, and we just start twisting them up. We twist from the center first, and then we just twist little bits and pieces out as we go up, making that well-known shape of a tree. You can do the same for the roots if you want the base to push out with roots, or you can just leave this flat. Once you've got a good shape, grab out a lighter. Be very careful with fire here, guys, and you should probably do this in a well-ventilated area because this is melting plastic essentially, but this will melt all of those plastic fuzzy bits back, leaving you with a really nice bark texture. If you're lucky enough to find some brown pipe cleaners like me, then they are good to go as is. So as you can see, this would probably do just fine as is, but I am going to coat these with a cheap brown acrylic paint. So we're just grabbing a really thick amount of this paint and layering it on over all of our trees. What I really like about these ones that I've already built is that the roots stem out and kind of work as a stand for the trees. But I also want to try making a few that just kind of go flat straight to the ground, as not every tree has a sprawling root system. So I'm going to repeat this entire process, but this time making one of my trees that just goes straight down to the ground with the trunk. This will mean that I need to glue it to a base. I like gel super glue for this kind of thing, as I just feel like it holds things together a little bit better and you can have a little bit more control. Since we're using a base, we're going to have to cover that up in a texture paint, just so we've got that nice earthy texture. That leaves us with a handful more bases to work with, and now we've just got to let that dry before we can add in our foliage. For the tops of these, we're going to do some with the clump foliage like before, but I also want to try out this faux moss that I found on Amazon. It's always great to have a bit of variety when we're trying to replicate nature. So once again, I'm coming in with the gel super glue, just touching up on all of these top areas of the plants and dunking it into the clump foliage.
I don't mind how these clump foliage ones turned out, but as you can see here, little bits tend to fall off them. I didn't really probably do the best job gluing these on compared to what I could have done, but it just takes a lot more effort to get all the little bits of clump foliage to stick. But it does look great. The next option is to cover them with this faux moss from Amazon.
So once again, we grab our base piece, we add some of that gel super glue and just start applying big chunks of this moss. I had to cut it away with scissors from the overall batch as it all sticks together, but that really just makes it stay nice and clumped up when you add it to the top of the tree. I really like how this turned out.
It's basically just a jumble of green thread, but it does a really good job at representing the foliage that we want it to.
But I want to take this to the next level, so I made up a few different trees with this and then grabbed out some quick grip glue. This is an aerosol adhesive that I've used a lot in the past, and I basically just gave the whole thing a pretty heavy spritz. Then grabbing out some small mixed up flocking that I've got from previous builds and dunking the whole thing in there. This really brought that to life, giving a lot more smaller details and pulling all of that loose thread look in.
These guys have worked out beautifully to really give it that more detailed individual leaves look. We now have a huge variety of different trees to work with, so it's time to take them to the next stage and start adding some fruits. You can buy kits like this that have tiny little foam balls in various colors. So we've got oranges, red for apples, and tiny little lemons. But not everyone has access to that or wants to spend the money. You can also keep an eye out at cheap stores or craft stores for something like this. I bought this pack of little green foam polyfoam balls for about $2 a while ago, and I barely ever use it, but that'll be perfect for some little green apples or whatever mystery fruit you want. Another alternative is some eye of newt, otherwise known as mustard seeds. These little guys cost me about $2 from the herbs and spices aisle of my local supermarket, and they are the perfect scale and size to be random little fruits. You could keep them the color that they are to be, I don't know, something, or you could paint them up once you have them on your tree. Honestly, you could probably stain them all up before you even started gluing them on. Another alternative is just covering them in flowering plants. So I have a heap of these blossom flowering tufts right here. You could also just use colored sand or colored foam flocking to add a little bit of extra color to these trees. So let's start picking out a few of our trees and adding some fruits.
I'm going to start with these tiny little fruit kits that I've gotten, using some matte Mod Podge and a toothpick to just randomly add blotches all over my tree and then start sticking down some of these tiny little lemons. It's a little bit fiddly, but if you put a tiny little bit of glue on the end of a tweezer or a stick, you can kind of pick up each of these tiny little foam balls and press them against the glue on the tree and they will hold in place. As always, I'm sure there are better ways to approach this, but this is what works for me. Once I had the tree covered, I decided I wanted to have a few that have fallen off on the ground around the base, making it look like these are ripe and ready to go. Now I'm going to repeat that process again, but this time with the oranges to give us a bit of variety in our fruit trees, just randomly covering up our plant and sticking all of these fruits in place. There was a lot of fiddly work throughout this entire process. Gluing down each of these different coloured beads obviously takes a little bit of time, and depending on how many fruits you want on the tree, it could take you quite a bit longer than even I was willing to spend. But ultimately, it looks so good and is so worth the effort. At least in my opinion. And since this is my build, my opinion is the only one that matters. Once I was done with all the foam balls, I wanted to try out that mustard seed. These are a perfect alternative if you can't get a hold of coloured foam balls, as these take staining really nicely. So the first batch I stained up with an orange and started gluing them onto my tree. I was really happy with how these looked, to tell you the truth, and I'm probably going to use these a lot more in the future rather than buying more of those fruit packs, as these are drastically cheaper and far easier to come across. And let's be honest, at this scale, no one is going to notice the difference. As long as there's a little bit of pop of colour on your trees, your players are going to know what they're looking at.
These mustard seeds actually turned out great. They're a super cheap, easy, and useful item that you can pick up at a supermarket. So I highly recommend trying these out. Obviously, I've only just tried them, so We'll see how they hold up over the long haul compared to the foam, but for the price, yeah, I recommend them.
And since they're perfect scale, I'm going to do one last tree just using the natural colour of the mustard seeds, giving us a really nice wide variety of different fruits on our trees. But not every tree is just covered in fruits. We want some covered in blossoming flowers. So I'm going to go back and grab one of the trees that are just covered in that foam moss, hit them up with that spray glue, and cover them with this colourful blossom flock that I got from a local hobby shop. If you can't get access to something like this flocking, you could always use coloured sand or really any small coloured bits and pieces to represent those flowers. And I love the way this looks.
And now I have a really nice variety of fruiting trees. These can play out in just about any situation, whether I mix them in with my other farm terrain or just throw them down on a random board or even out in the wild because, well, fruits grow in the wild too. It could also give you something extra for your players to notice on the board, and maybe you could have some kind of special interaction. A poisonous tree, maybe a magical fruit, or just some extra rations to pick up your supply along the way. You know what they say? An apple a day keeps the cleric away. That's a D&D joke for those of you who don't get it. I do have plans to expand on these and probably build out a full farm orchard, but for now, I have to pack up this entire studio and move house. So I'll have to save that for the next one. This is our last video in my studio. It has served me really well and I am going to miss it, but I'm hoping I can make something cool where I end up and we can end up with a new, unique crafting space that hopefully gives me the ability to build even more and bigger things. So you served me well. It's time for me to start packing this up. I hope you guys have found some inspiration in today's build. I'd love to see your versions of these fruiting trees. And if you've got any other cool ways to approach the fruiting trees builds, let me know in the comments below. I will be adding more tiny little 3D printed bits to these, but like I mentioned, I've got to pack down my entire studio, so I'll focus more on that in the next one. I hope you found something you like in this build, and until next time, never stop making stuff.